Good morning all, and welcome to the Living Labs Roundtable, Redefining How We Build. My name is Carter Kraft. I'm with the Economic Department of the Netherlands Consulate in New York City. Let me just talk through a little bit of this morning's logistics. The program will run from 10 to 11:30 with some question and answer after each of our two presentations. What we're hoping is that you will share in the chat self-introduction, name, organization, contact info. The chat window is also great for sharing links to upcoming events, sharing documents to reports or publications or other things that you're working on. And we're also going to ask you to please post questions there. Before you go, whether you can only stay for a little while or stay for the whole session, we welcome suggestions for future featured projects or featured topics, as this is the first in a series of Redefining How We Build programs, which the Consulate is launching this fall. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Delft Hogewoning, the Consul General of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in New York. Delft, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carter, and thank you all for joining us today for this program on Living Labs, Redefining How We Build. And let me start by thanking the Climate Group for their leadership and creativity in keeping this Climate Week in the year 2020 an active forum. The world cannot wait for all of us to start taking more proactive steps to address our climate crisis. Today's program is actually the first in a series of programs on building with nature that our office will be hosting this fall, along with our colleagues in the Embassy Network of the Netherlands in the United States. And if you signed up for today's program via Eventbrite or Zoom, we will also send you follow-on invitations for those upcoming programs. For today, let me start with just a few introductory points. First, Buiksloterham is an important story on urban adaptation. From our office here in New York City, we have the opportunity to connect and learn from the major cities in the Northeast US, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Portland, Maine. And what I have seen in my 4 years here in New York is that the major Dutch cities, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague, all face the same challenges and opportunities as American cities in terms of governance, in terms of economic value and performance, and in terms of public and social benefits for the people who live or work there. So today is a bit of an exercise in shared learning. On the occasion of Climate Week in the year 2020, it's more important than ever that we develop and build traction on ambitious goals. I'm sure everyone heard the news earlier this week about the new commitment of China to achieve a carbon neutral economy by 2060. I think we all agree that the sooner we get moving in the right direction, the sooner we can get there. Thirdly, I'm here to learn too. I've heard and read how in Buiksloterham, the district, the sectors of business, government and knowledge institutes, such as schools and universities, have contributed to the area's growth. From the Dutch perspective, we used to call this a triple helix. In recent years, we've come to recognize the important role of civil society and NGOs, organizations. And now we have this quadruple helix. As civil servants, we try proactively to bring these diverse players together to make good things happen. And let me stress again during Climate Week that we all need to mobilize in this direction. Last, I want to offer my thanks as well to the diverse group of participants we've attracted to today's program. I hope we can continue to stir up and catalyze some useful conversations that hopefully turn into collaborations. Now, let me pause here and hand the virtual microphone over to Mr. Matthijs Bouw, who will introduce our speakers. Matthijs is involved, as you might know, in a number of projects of urban redevelopment projects. and coastal resilience projects, both here in New York City, nearby in Boston, and other places around the globe. Matthijs is principal and founder of One Architecture and Urbanism, with their US office on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Welcome, Matthijs, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolf, and thank you all for allowing me to join today. I'm really pleased to get a chance to introduce our speakers. We have two speakers today. The first is Ms. Saskia Muller, who leads the circular lab efforts in Buiksloterham in Amsterdam North. And our second speaker is Professor Masoot Gandhari of the New York University Tandon School of Engineering and the Center of Urban Science and Progress. It's better known as CUSP. And after Saskia's presentation, I'll help to field a few questions, and I hope to be helped in that by Sonia Plessett of the Stone Foundation, who is setting up a fantastic living lab in the Boston Harbor. And it's really great to see not only her, but quite a few other folks from Boston in this webinar. And then we'll pivot back after those questions to bring the folks back to New York City and to Masoot, who will give in his presentation, I hope, a sort of preview of some of the phenomenal and interesting research that is happening in New York City. But let me just give a few remarks before Saskia begins, basically about my connection to Buiksloterham and why I find this an incredibly important development. I was born less than a kilometer from Buiksloterham in Amsterdam North, which when I was born there was a really decidedly unglamorous place. It was really a sort of working class part of the city, which provided the housing for all the ship wharves and the industry that was at the north of the IJ. After the financial crisis, collectives and individuals started to make this into what is now one of the most interesting places in Amsterdam. And Saskia will tell you all much more about it. But what I found really interesting in this place is that not only is it a fertile ground of experimentation with new technologies that will help us deal with such issues as climate, but it's also fertile ground for experimentation with what you would call social technology. It's about how people their own city and making their own future. And as we face big questions related to climate change, and that's why I think it's very opportune to have this panel in the Climate Week, big questions about how we adapt and mitigate to the climate crisis, how we make these big societal transitions that are necessary, that are systemic, that are open-ended, that are filled with uncertainty. I come to realize that it's specifically collaboration or the social technology that will be key to whether we succeed. Learned a lot maybe from being Dutch and coming from a culture where we really invest in collaboration, where you have indeed this quadruple helix, where we have tools like pilots and living labs and all kinds of other forms that will help us figure out this future. So for me, I feel connected to the place by birth. I'm really happy that as an office, we've been involved with a number of projects in the area of Buiksloterham, through the Hackable City, through working with groups of self-builders building apartment buildings, through a bio refinery. But what I really take from this is it's the social technology that we need to focus on. And I'm really happy and thankful for the Dutch Consulate General in New York to be hosting a series of webinars where that topic is really central. We need new models, and I hope that Saskia will show us the way forward. So thank you, Saskia.
Saskia, you're on mute still.
Okay, sorry, I'll start again. Thank you, Matthijs. Thank you all for coming to listen to this story of the City Lab of Buiksloterham and its whereabouts. It's now some 6 years old, I would say, and well, I'll try to explain to you. Matthijs has already given you one very important conclusion about the City Lab, that societal transitions and social networks and models are very important. I will get back to that later, of course. Matthijs has also already told you that the area where Buiksloterham is located has not always been a very sexy area, although it's quite popular at the moment. That has not been the case for centuries, really. And even in the past century, it was not an area where most people would like to go. It's an area of some 100 hectares, as Matthijs has explained. It is a formal industrial area. There were a lot of shipyards and shipping-related industries that have moved in the 80s with the downfall of that sector. Then we got an enormous crisis, also financial crisis, as he has explained. When we started the Living Lab, or the proceedings to get to the Living Lab, there were only some 40 people living, so not 14, but 40 people living in the area. In these days, hardly anything was built. We're now talking about like 2010, more or less around that. And when the city had been making plans to develop the area that were, weren't developed very quickly because of the crisis. At the moment, I think there are some 1,000, just a bit over 1,000 people living there. And to give you an idea, when the newest plans of the city will be executed, in the end, there will be some 20,000 people living in this area. So we're not there yet. There's loads of opportunities to come to change. Okay, could I have another sheet, Carter? I will try to relate the activities and the goals of the Buiksloterham Living Lab to the fields of clean energy, of mobility and infrastructure, of public mobilization, and of the climate impacts of the building. The sheet you see now, we call, as you can see, Uptown Amsterdam. It's a bit wider than the exact area that is Buiksloterham. What you see at the lowest part of the picture is the IJ River, which is the river that sort of separates the city in the northern and the southern part. At the southern shore, more or less across the Buiksloterham, there is the central station, the central train station of the city. So that gives you an idea of how well located we are and why partly this area is so popular. Okay, we already knew it in 2014, and what we knew was that circularity is necessary and possible. I've told you about this crisis. The whole idea of development of the city couldn't be just realized because nobody was interested in developing real estate in this area. Nobody thought there was any money in it at that time. So the city came up with a very nice idea. They gave out some plots to those who came up with a sustainable building plan, as sustainable as possible. And in that way, and these plots were either for individual buildings, houses, or for collectives that wanted to build residential estates. And in that way, a group of people came involved in the area that wanted to build in a different way, in a more circular or at least sustainable way. And they were at the basis. Matthijs was one of these people. The metabolic lab was another organization was involved. There were more architects who said, we don't want to just build one sustainable building or a circular building. We want to develop an area that is circular, because there are so many things when it comes to circularity that cannot be realized in just one house. You need a whole infrastructure around houses and industries or offices that is circular. So you need a bigger scale if you really want to achieve something. So this living lab is basically a self-declared thing. It's not something, it doesn't have any legal status. It is not something, well, it's something that occurs, of course, in more places in the Netherlands and in the US. But you can't derive any rights from it. And it's a private initiative. The reason we got acknowledged is that we have started with some research. Maybe we can get the next sheet to show you part of what this research resulted about the metabolism analysis. This acknowledgement has come through research that was done. We wrote a report about the Buiksloterham, and what we said was, if the zoning plan that was valid in these days, if we extrapolate that, if we completely execute the whole plan, it would take another 20 years. What will happen to the area? And if we don't want, what happens, like a very stony, petrified area with an enormous energy demand, etc. What can we do to avoid it? So by doing that research and the hackable city research that Matthijs has briefly told about, and through the manifesto we drew up that we had signed by many parties, we sort of got an acknowledgement from some 22 partners. Among those are the municipal water company, Waternet, the municipality itself. Two of our vice mayors signed the manifesto, some housing corporations who are building in the area, and quite a few knowledge and research institutions. So the Living Lab has very strong local roots, but at the same time there are public and private organizations with stakes in the area involved, which I think is very interesting. Both inhabitants and parties that are willing to invest. So the main goal of the City Lab is to help to enhance a development that is as circular as possible. We're building for 30 to 300 years, maybe even more. I don't know how long all the buildings will last, but what we invest now in 8,500 houses and all the materials we'll carry in, they have an enormous impact on nature and climate and the earth, of course, on the planet. And all the things we can avoid while building, also building bridges, roads, etc., the whole infrastructure should be done as circular as possible. There is a social goal as well, as Matthijs has already told about. It's not just a technological goal. It's not something we put in numbers and gave to the municipality, said, could you please do it this way? No, it's something we want to develop together with people living and working in the area. So there's also a goal in the way we do it, in the approach. And one of the means, or an important mean of a city lab, of course, is experiment. And this experiment doesn't have to do so much with new technology. Of course, it's rather new what we try to implement here, or what we would like to have implemented. But what we've seen, I'll get back to that a bit more elaborately, is that the systemic change is much more important. What you see if you want to try to reach serious circular or very sustainable, at least, developments, is that you need a lot of cooperation, and that all the different parts of the chain have to come together in order to make it work. So we have a broad scope. Could I have a new sheet? It's not either this or that or that. That is something that the city often wants. They want to experiment, but they want experiments with heat networks in one part of the city and experiments with biological treatment of wastewater in yet another part of the city. What we've said is you should try to do as many of these things in this one area to see how they go together. And for instance, the treatment of wastewater in the area in a biological generator comes up, has as a result green gas, but also heat. If you produce this heat by processing this wastewater, you should do something useful with it. If you have a local heat network with a low temperature, you can use the heat from the biorefinery in your local heat network. If you don't have that, or if you have a high temperature heat network, this heat will become useless, and that would be a waste. This is a very simple example, but there are more, of course, of how these different innovations should interact and can, well, how you can reach synergy by applying them together in this one area. This is not something that comes easy, because it means you have to join forces with all these different organizations, or many different organizations that work here. In this case, for instance, the housing corporation, the water company, the municipality that has to give all the permits for it. So that's rather complicated. Okay, let me say something about clean energy. Clean energy in the Netherlands is like in the US, I suppose, although I don't know very much about your policy, but I think it's the same. There is a national, in the Netherlands, even a European level, a regional level, a local level. And in our case, there is the level of the neighborhood where we can do something with clean energy. When you look at the national level, there is almost all-encompassing climate change agreement since last year, which comprises of global goals and standards for creating clean energy and getting to a CO2 neutral Netherlands in 2050. These are all numbers and ambitious goals. What we try in Buitsloterham when it comes to clean energy to do what we can do in the neighborhood and experiment with that. So one of the things we try to create as much as possible is low temperature heat and cold networks. These can be rather small networks that are fed by aquathermal sources, for instance, with heat pumps that can, especially in newly built houses, provide enough heat and cold for the summers that tend to get hotter and hotter in the Netherlands, that can provide enough heat and cold for houses to make them comfortable to live in. And then we don't need the high temperature heat that comes from waste incineration that will have no future in our view. Then we try to experiment with smart grids. There is an interesting group of floating houses called Clean Ship, Schoon Schip, that have created a smart grid, a micro smart grid between all of them. They have a lot of solar panels on their boats or houses, and they share their electricity, and they try to store it when the yield is big, when the sun is shining, and try to use it when at moments the sun doesn't. So they have their own batteries. This is something that we would like to see in more places in the neighborhood, and it's something that you don't need to scale of the whole city for. You can do it on a much lower scale in the neighborhood. Another thing we have achieved in this area is that we've worked with a rather low energy prestation coefficient. I hope this is the right translation. It is a number that we use to express the amount of energy that is used by a building. So far it's been lower in the Buiksloterham than what the national permit demand, the national rules standards demand. So these are some examples of how we have achieved, well, new, how we've taken new steps to get to more clean energy. When we started, our goal was to completely provide to provide our own energy for 100%. That was something we wanted. And what we found out from research we did together with the University of Delft is that it is in an area, in a highly, in a very dense, highly urban area like Buiksloterham will be, it is impossible with the technology as it is now to provide enough electricity for the whole area to run on. We do need sources from outside. So in that sense, our conclusion at the moment is that it's not possible to be completely circular in that respect, unfortunately. But this may change when solar panels become better, when we can use solar energy on the facades of the buildings, etc., when that becomes a bit cheaper as well. Okay. Let me tell you something about how we've structured the Living Lab, because we can talk about energy, mobility, etc., but how do we organize it? I think our Living Lab is a bit anarchistic in the sense that we have no boss. The Living Lab is at the moment actually a small board of 3 people, and then there is a colleague of mine and me, and we run the Living Lab. But it's not about us, it's about all the partners that are connected, all the people in the area who live here and who will come to live here, because future inhabitants often are also connected, that make things possible. So there is no, say, hierarchical structure in which activities are decided about or not. When we start doing things, often the initiative comes from 1 or more partners, and the lab becomes involved when there's a small remuneration because we can't do everything completely for free, or when the impact is very big. When we think something's very important and there's no money, we will collaborate and try to make it work. And so the decision-making of projects doesn't really take place in the Living Lab, but takes place between partners who are involved in a project. The advantage of this is that projects or activities who are lacking support basically don't take place because nobody will start it. And there is always an enormous and necessary investment readiness, because it's very easy to make plans, but when there's no one who wants to invest in it, it's no use. The disadvantage of this way of organizing, of course, is that there's no way to enforce cooperation if you want it, and cooperation is a key thing. Another advantage is that we spend very little time on meetings and red tape and internal things because there's so little structure, basically. Could I get the next sheet, Carter? On this picture, you can see a few of the things that are very interesting, I think, in this area, and that have played a very important role in getting to the Living Lab. Upside on the left, you see these floating houses I talked about, Schoon Schip. This is a render. Nowadays, it's really been realized. There are 47 floating houses in one of the canals in the area. And this is where the smart grid has been realized. To the right of that, you see the famous Café de Keuvel, which is a small former shipyard where they put 10 old houseboats that couldn't be used any longer in the water because they were really almost antique. They put them on the land where they could still be used, and they're all small studios and workshops and ateliers, and they're used as such. And this is a, for the moment at least, it's a temporary place where a lot of small innovations take place for the next 10 years.
Hey Saskia, sorry to interrupt, Carter here. I think I got the slides out of sync, but hopefully I'm back on the correct slide with the floating houses and Dakota.
Oh, I will check, sorry.
Thank you, sorry.
Let me see, yeah, this is okay, yeah, good, thanks. At the lowest row on the left, you see what was for quite some time the biggest wooden building in Amsterdam, and this is a result of one of the circular or at least sustainable tenders that the city came up with during the crisis. And it's an apartment building. Now there is another much higher wooden building, but still this is one of the milestones, I think, in the history of the lab. It's called Patch 22. And to the right, you see something that has been completed now, but it's nice to show this picture. This is a row of houses of the first people who got an individual plot and started building their own individual houses. One of them is from someone who has also been very active in the City Lab, Frank Alsma, and he built his house, as we say, from eBay, from Marktplaats in Dutch. He tried, and he succeeded quite well to build his house from almost only second-hand and third-hand materials, stairs, window panes, window sills, doors. He tried to fit everything in. I think his architect has gone mad. It must have been a nightmare, but he managed quite well to do that. So this is a very nice example of circular building. This is just to give you an idea of different things that are happening in the area with some pictures with it. Knowledge management, of course, is quite important in the lab because if you experiment and if you try new things, you have to try to learn from it and pass the knowledge on. Because we have such a light structure, it means that all the partners are primarily themselves responsible for keeping the knowledge, sharing it, and keeping it up to date and using it again. Next to the public and private partners that I've mentioned, we cooperate with the Technical University of Delft and the Technical University at Wageningen, with AMS. It's an institute that sort of combines the Wageningen and Delft research, and with the University of Amsterdam, and they've all in different fields helped us to do smaller and bigger research, come up with students and trainees, and well, that helps a lot because we can't do all that on our own. But still keeping all this knowledge together or bringing it all together and in a way so it's well traceable for people from outside is quite difficult because it takes a lot of funding and time that we don't have. So I think in that sense, well, we could have done better, although I don't really know how. What we've asked this week, while a big plan for the Buiksloterhang was being discussed in the City Council in Amsterdam, is that the city comes up with a monitoring system for the area so we can, for, as I said, there are 1,000 people living now, it will be 20,000, so we're not there yet. So it's still early enough to start monitoring and see to what extent we will achieve the goals that we have set for the future. And I hope they will be ready to invest in that. Otherwise, well, it will be a lot of words, but then we can't measure what has happened. The next sheet, talking about knowledge. is an interesting example of how we started with research and collecting knowledge about several fields that are of importance. This is about energy. And in this sheet, you can see how we have, based on research that was done elsewhere, how we have put together the different measures we could take in the area. It's all theory, at least in these days. This is from 2014. The different measures we can take in the area in order to get to the goal that we wanted to achieve in 2035 in the field of energy. We've made schemes like this also for materials and for other fields. And here you can see that in green at the top, Buiksloterham is energy self-sufficient. And as I've told you, this is something so far that we think we cannot reach. Okay, something about transport, infrastructure, mobility. This is all about local measures. One of the things we've done to start with is organize a mobility workshop with the municipality, with experts and people from the area. Just to collect a lot of ideas and wishes and sorrow and concerns that people have in the area. After that, we have tried to stimulate the city to come up with a very good plan for building logistics, because there will be so much building in the area that we think that might be a problem in the future. So we've lobbied for an idea about a central building where all the building materials that are carried into the area will be collected, and from there they should be distributed by smaller electric carts, for instance, or boats. This is an idea we took from Stockholm, where it was very successful, and we've tried to make it executable in the city. We haven't. This hasn't happened yet, but it's an example of how we try to make things happen here. It's really the city that should organize it as a general party that could also impose the use of this to people who work in the area, who build here. Then there is shared mobility. We think and the parking standards here are quite low, maybe compared to New York they aren't, or to Philadelphia or Boston, but here there are a few parking places, less than one per apartment. So we've tried to find out what people want instead of having their own car. So we did opinion polls among inhabitants and future inhabitants. And after we'd selected two parties that can provide shared mobility, we have tried to help find them places to put their electric cars, but also their electric scooters, their electric cargo bikes, electric bikes, because we want multimodal transport. Also enhance the use of it. Basically, it's a kind of marketing that we try to do as well. And we've lobbied at the city for shared spaces, less cars, more place for cyclists and people who go by foot, better public transportation, because that's still a problem here, and extra space for bikes, because that's something that's lacking. And then the social part, engaging the public and democracy. Could I have another sheet, Carter? We have we tried to make things fun, so we hired a cartoonist who made a very nice drawing of Buiksloterham. Buik is belly, sloot is a ditch, and ham is ham, and that's how the name of our area is. Can be expressed in a drawing. And could I have another sheet? Because one of the things we've tried in the beginning is something we call Play the City, together with all the people interested, some people living here, some others coming from different parts, people from housing corporations, all the partners, etc. We played a game in order to develop on paper in a game the area to see where conflicts might arise, which places are popular, which places aren't, etc. That was part of getting everybody in. At the moment, we have a small office in the area, but we also have meeting places where we can organize all kinds of workshops and meetings with people in the area, together with organizations or only people who work here. We're trying to get the people who live in the social housing which is takes more time because most of the people who started living here bought their houses. It's a different group, socially speaking, than the ones that come here and rent a place. Everybody, residents and local entrepreneurs, are very welcome with ideas, questions, complaints, etc. And we try to organize meetings in order to let them speak out. And then, of course, we ask people to do something, because a Twitter account is nice, but we want things done. That sometimes is a problem. People like very much to talk about what they would like to see and what want to happen in the area. If you ask people to become active or invest, then sometimes it's hard. Just a brief word for the sake of time about climate impact and adaptation. Just a few examples of what has happened here. I've already told you about the biorefinery. There will be a floating biorefinery where the wastewater from a few hundred households will be processed. There are ample rainproof measures in the area in order to cope with huge showers in the future that we expect. Partly in the green in the buildings, partly in buddies in the public area. We will install grinders in part of the buildings. For you, I think in the US that's quite normal in cities, but here in the Netherlands it's still not even allowed basically in houses. So it also demands changing laws. And in quite a few places here now we see all kinds of shared devices like washing machines, also shared cars, shared tools, which is also something that enhances the sustainability of the area. And in public tenders, when new plots of land are going to be tendered, at least 50% of the criteria will have to do with sustainability. And there will be material passports obligatory for all buildings in the area that will be built from now on. Okay, I will finalize with a few lessons learned. A living lab, as I said, is a mix of technical interventions and systemic interventions. Circular business models require a new set of rules and roles. Could you get this almost last sheet on, Carter? So many people are focused on the technology, but as I said in the beginning, the systemic interventions are very important. We've made an inventory of all the hampering rules and laws in the area. And what we found out that, of course, there are some, but often, especially in the building process, it has a lot to do with, this is the way we do it. And that is something that often is much more hampering than all the official legal impediments that you encounter. So you have to ignore-ganize, as we've called it, unnecessary rules and regulations and these old habits and self-made conventions. The local government has a lot of innovative ideas, far more than we can implement, but they don't have an innovation strategy. The government doesn't pay enough attention, not at all enough attention to the innovation of this operational process. So there are a lot of political goals, mainly political, politically formulated, but that's not what happens in the end. That's not how people work. Plot-wise development, that's what we've had here. It's not just one area that's developed at once. It happens plot by plot. Is sometimes hampering innovation because the small scales impede sound business cases, and it also impedes big infrastructural changes that well, have to do with more than just one plot or more than two plots. Densification and sustainability are a troublesome marriage. Enough green, trees, bushes, parks, soccer fields, etc. But also the yield of solar and wind, I've told about it already, are very hard to achieve in an area with high-rise buildings, like in the place where you live. And semi-public companies, let's start with something positive, play a pivotal role in infrastructural innovations. We have very good experiences here in the Living Lab with the water company, with housing corporations, with Leander, the network operator here for electricity and gas. They are really willing to innovate. They often got money to invest, and well, that has helped us a lot. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia, for this inspiring presentation. In the service of time, I won't be asking too many questions, but I'd like to give the floor to people who are also working on Living Labs, because they asked maybe the more pertinent questions, and we'll focus on, I think, the lessons that can be learned. And so I would like to give the floor to Sonja Plesset of the Stone Foundation, who can maybe talk a bit more to this audience about what you're trying to do in Boston, and then direct a question to Saskia.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you, Saskia, for a fascinating presentation. In the Living Lab I'm just going to take off my headphone. Can you hear me okay? In the Living Lab in Boston, we are looking at ways to pilot nature-based solutions that can address the importance of coastal resiliency with the increasing storm severity, sea level rise, et cetera, due to climate change. And what we've done, which is slightly different from the way that you've set things out in your circular city, is that we've at the outset formed an official partnership with a number of different entities, the City of Boston, the National Park Service, Boston Harbor Now. We have Kathy Abbott here who might want to comment as well. Boston Harbor Now is the NGO partner. The Stone Foundation as the funder, and University of Massachusetts Boston as the academic partner. And so what I want to ask you, and I'm happy to speak in greater detail perhaps later about the types of projects that we're envisioning at the Living Lab, but what I'm interested in hearing from you is really about this social contract that you've described has been established. And at the outset, you mentioned that there's no legal status. This is a self-declared enterprise or initiative. And so how do you get buy-in? How do you get people to engage in this social contract? It's fascinating. It would be wonderful. We could all imagine if we could set these types of circular neighborhood cities up across the world, but how do you get people to participate? That's my question.
Well, I hope you don't mind, but I think maybe I've called it a social contract. It's possible. It's not a contract really. What we tried to do, and in the beginning that happened quite naturally because we had a group of people here together that were interested, that were engaged anyway, and wanted to be involved because it was their interest to develop the area as circular as possible. So that was the group from the very beginning. that operated at the very start. Then it was much easier than it is now, I must say. What you see, there is an enormous lack of housing in Amsterdam and of affordable housing, like in all big cities in the world. So many people who come and live here, whether they rent a house or buy a house, are happy they found a place, especially the people who rent. And they are not necessarily interested in something like circularity. Some of these people said, well, I'm sorry, they really apologized to me. They said, I'm sorry, but I'm not really in favor of sustainability because it costs a lot. Well, what you can do then, at least you're talking to these people, you're in touch with them. You can try to talk about it, explain, and something, and for instance, about things that don't cost money. But well, it very much you can't. There's not just one way to engage people. You have to. It is very time-consuming. That's what I find, because all these different groups demand different things. The people from the very beginning, for instance, want really different things and are in some ways quite radical at the moment about new plans compared to the people who just came in. So you need a diversified strategy, so to say, and just talk to these people, really create a community, organize a lot of meetings, make it nice, don't make promises you can't keep. People have to trust you, and you have to like it, because if you don't, then it doesn't work. Is that a bit of an answer?
No, that's helpful. And I'm also wondering about the scale. I mean, you mentioned the benefits of having the scale as it is. Could you talk a little bit about the issue of scale and whether you see larger or smaller geographic locations as working as well?
Well, it started with very small plots, especially with the individuals building a house, of course. And I think in the future now, the city is busy making a new investment plan for the next, 13 years, more or less. And so in this next stage, where there will be a lot more densification than we expected before, than was foreseen in the zoning plan. The areas will be much bigger, I think, and there will be much less space for individual projects. So that means that there will be a lot of more formal procedures for achieving sustainability or circularity. And it's a city that owns part of the soil, not all, and they will tender the plots they have and put demands to those who want to win, of course. Bigger plots, which in a way is an advantage, because if you want to create a heat network, you can't do that for just one or two houses. That's not worthwhile. So in a way, I think it's an advantage.
I wonder if there's questions from others in Boston about lessons we can learn from Saskia.
And not only from Boston, I would say. But let's start with questions from Boston.
This is Kathy Abbott. Nice to meet you. And yeah, I love the citizen engagement and sort of the democratic ideals that you represent. I'm curious as to how Sonia talked about the very formal way in which we've engaged government and nonprofit in the initiation of our lab and private. But I'm curious as to how you engage the government sector, the business sector, and maybe the broader nonprofit sector in your work.
Well, there is not just one way. When I would have to characterize the activities of the lab, the things we can do from the area to engage them, it's lobbying. When this new development plan comes up, we try to influence it as much as possible, which I know since yesterday is not very easy. we come up with suggestions, like I talked about building logistics, an idea we took from Stockholm. We try to get it into the city, and we invite people from Sweden to come over and explain and try to convince people. So that's also a way. We do research. I've been involved in research on low temperature heat networks in order to collect more scientific knowledge, scientifically based knowledge about the possibility of these networks in order to convince the city of the feasibility of these networks, because they doubt it. So there are very many different ways to involve people, and of course it's talking to these partners a lot, knowing what they want, what they try to do, and then by getting, well, we're the spider in the web, so to say, and try to connect partners with each other when you think, hey, they have ideas that we could bring together.
That was actually the first question, which I submitted to you on the chat, was how do the partners find you, or do you find the partners? And my guess is it's both, but.
Yeah, and some partners are, when you look at the 22 from the beginning, quite a few have left as active partners. Some because their role has stopped in the area, and some because well, they thought it not useful for them to participate, and others have stayed on, like two housing corporations, the water company is still very active in the area.
I think, thank you, Kathy, for the questions, and thank you, Saskia, for the answers. I think before we pivot to Masoot, I just want to acknowledge a really, I think, important question which relates to the equity question that Saskia also addressed, the fact that there are new people who in the neighborhood who have different concerns than the innovation, and with that might not feel all that comfortable in such an environment. And I think that's really important. So I would love to have a conversation on that after Masoot's presentation, because I feel that it's really critical. But for now, I'm really happy to introduce Professor Masoot Gandhari, who is leading a research project at the Tandon School to study the thermal interaction of the built and the natural environment, especially in dense urban areas. And he and his team started to work by mapping the surface temperature of the New York skyline for Midtown Manhattan and Hoboken. And they followed this up by a series of papers published in, let's say, Nature Communications and Nature Scientific Reports. And I hope we can share that in the chat window. But during the summer, Carter, whom you know, at the consulate, helped to connect them to his former colleagues and longtime collaborators at the Harbor School and the Billion Oyster Project, so that they could expand the data collection in Lower Manhattan and the harbor from the vantage points of Governors Island. And I think that collaborative efforts that Masoot had with the Harbor School are really interesting, also because they start to look at the connections to the high school curriculum and to a sort of understanding of issues of climate and energy in those curricula. So I hope that I'm really happy that Masoot found the time to sort of share some of initial outcomes and of that research with us today. So welcome, Masoot. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, appreciate your introduction. As Matthias mentioned earlier, I work at NYU, and at the School of Engineering, the Department of Urban Engineering. I also belong to this center known as Center for Urban Science and Progress. And in the spirit of living labs, I should mention that the center, known as CUSP, was launched by the former mayor of New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, with the intention of creating a partnership between the academia and the city agencies. Yeah, particularly through the lens of information. You know, as you may know, Bloomberg, you know, his fame is basically use of information for financial services, and that's how he became one of the leading business people in this area. And so, and in the spirit of the Climate Week, I thought maybe I should, I wasn't exactly sure how to, you know, go about this brief 15-minute presentation, but I thought maybe what I should do is just briefly, a couple of slides show you sort of the framework perhaps for the Living Lab, the way I see it, followed by 4 papers in the area briefly, then briefly a couple of federally funded projects, and then finally Governor's Island that was mentioned earlier that Carter has been, you know, working towards creating a collaboration, you know, between, you know, perhaps Netherlands and the US in the area of climate action. So that's what I'll do. I will share my screen and let's see if this works well. Am I sharing this okay with you? It's just coming to...
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect.
Although you might press present so it's a tiny bit bigger on the screen.
How's that? I put it on the present mode.
Okay, it's not there, but don't worry about it.
Oh, all right. Let me do it a different way. Okay.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, the present mode does not work very well. No problem. What I'll do is that I'll get this one out of the way. All right, is it okay? Okay, unfortunately my animations won't work if it's not in the present mode. So I'm just gonna put it in the present mode and just go for it.
Yeah.
Let me just press this. All right, so I just want to double check with you, sorry about this. Do you see the slide titled Living Labs?
Correct. Yep.
Yes, okay, perfect. All right, so, you know, so this information thing and data thing that I was referring to, if I was to fit it within this Living Labs context, and in a way it's kind of looking on the left side as information, right? And how do you enhance sort of the content that you're dealing with? Resolution, diversity, you know, what kinds and all that, coverage. What are ways of integrating such data? What are the platforms you deal with? And on the right side is more on the sort of disciplinary side, frankly, on the interdisciplinary side. And the reason I put stakeholders here is this is where those agencies that I referred to from the Center for Urban Science and Progress and Bloomberg's vision and all that. So for example, the center has memorandum of understanding with 11 New York City agencies and a very, very robust integration plan by how student projects are formulated through partnership. And frankly, many of these students are then employed by the agency. So from an ecosystem point of view, it works quite well. And then, so then what does it take them to then create models that interface in order to address important phenomena of interest? And so if we were to kind of, if I or, you know, we were to look at this Living Lab, I would say one of the major things to address are sort of this interdependencies among these systems, the physical, the human, and the natural. And of course, the institutional is embedded in it. The institution is kind of in the human systems piece of it. The governance that Saskia was referring to is in a way sort of part of that human systems. And so the objectives for such living labs perhaps would be, you know, to have actionable insights, to really be able to have predictive capabilities, and then finally scaling so that a lab can then be sort of used to learn. So having said that, I thought I would just present four articles that relates to this climate week point, particularly with respect to emissions and heat and so on and so forth. So the first paper, it's a 2017 Nature scientific report, was an interesting study we did. We obtained this fancy instrument which essentially takes full images of whatever scene you want in multiple wavelengths in the thermal band. So in a way you can do spectroscopy. And the idea was, let's look at the skyline of New York and see what are all the constituents that exist in this skyline. Well, among the many things that showed up was actually refrigerant gases. And it was quite interesting because, we looked at New York City every 3 minutes for 1 week. And in every single frame, there was a refrigerant gas. And so we decided to write a paper on that. And the interesting thing about this refrigerant gas is that, the Montreal Protocol, whoops, sorry, I don't know what happened there. I didn't do this. This is some, okay, sorry. All right.
Hey, Masoot, sorry to interrupt, Masoot. I pulled up the animation in the event that you weren't able to get it in, so I can bring it down. I can run play whenever you tell me to. But I think we should be sharing at the same time. I think you're on slide 1.
Do you see the slide that says mapping refrigerant gases?
No, I only saw the introductory slide.
Oh, that's terrible. Okay.
If you go into that window and just make sure you click on the PowerPoint screen, you can advance. Maybe it's toggling back and forth between Zoom.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure why this was.
No problem. I can unshare this and share it later if you want, or I can leave it.
Yeah, if you can unshare that, and then I'll.
Got it. There we go. That looks good. Thank you.
What, do you see me there?
I do. I see you out at Coney Island with that palm tree over your shoulder, and then I see some
not
slides.
Not me, the slides.
I see the slides too.
All right, good. This thing, Living Labs, data, phenomenology, and all that?
Yep.
Okay, good. So anyway, so this was the idea, data on the left side, domain on the right side, creating models to, make sense out of it. And then the idea was, what is sort of the human, natural, and physical systems and the interdependencies, and what are the goals, perhaps? How do you create, actionable insights and so on and so forth. So I'm sorry about the situation with this slide. Now, by the way, you see the slide that says some Living Labs articles?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right. So anyway, so this was the deal. We saw a bunch of refrigerant gases. And the thing about Montreal Protocol was that the CFCs, which created a huge ozone, it was an ozone depleting substance, was banned, and it was a real success. I would say the Montreal Protocol was a success in climate action, that 170 nations got together and CFC concentrations basically dropped from concentration that created a hole in the ozone to virtually undetectable quantities. And that was really a success. But the issue was that the replacement for that refrigerant gas, which was CFC, which is another substance, which does not have an ozone depleting potential, turns out that it has a very high global warming potential. As a matter of fact, 10,000 times global warming potential. And so we're actually working on a second paper on this, which discusses, sort of technological breakthroughs and institutional breakthroughs in how do you deal with this sort of apparent issue at the moment. So anyway, so that was that. Sorry, all these animations are not going to work, but so I'm not going to do any animations. So the second paper was, we looked at New York City skyline, mapped the surface temperatures over time for 3 weeks, and did some interesting modeling, numerical simulations, and wrote basically a paper on that. And this is something that I'll follow up briefly with respect to Governor's Island. The next was an interesting work that we did with some colleagues at the medical school, which we basically looked at exposure of people in subway stations over time and tracked what you could call as burden of disease. So if you know how many people, well, we basically use people's cell phone signals as they were passing by a given location. So we know how many people passed that point at any given time, and we knew the concentration of the pollutants. And then at that point, the burden of disease would be the number of people multiplied by the pollution that they're exposed to. And so if you do this over time, then you end up with kind of an interesting picture of the burden of disease at a location. And then finally, the fourth paper that I wanted to draw your attention to, and incidentally, these are all open source papers, so they're available online, open source. This is a Nature's Communications paper, which really talked about, and it's very pertinent to the city as a lab concept, is that what does it take to be able to look at impact of the environment, particularly the urban environment, at the level of the individual, because that's sort of individualizing some of these insights is what it talked about. One of the things that, and one of the areas that I'm interested in, and I work quite a bit in, is sort of in this whole concept of exposure analysis in cities. Exposure to extremes, particularly, whether it's heat or pollution or storms and so on and so forth. And so in this particular case, it talked about what does it take to gain a deeper understanding of the impact of the living environment at the level of the individual. And that is where you can start addressing some of the equity questions that Matthias was referring to, perhaps. And so that's kind of an interesting work for people who are interested in this sort of topics. This paper is also open source. Now, Ferrari from the project, so I thought maybe I will pull out two that are pertinent to this topic for today. One is, as a matter of fact, called City as a Lab. That was the topic, that was the title of the proposal that was funded by National Science Foundation. It's basically, this is the food, energy, water nexus study. We're focusing it on New York City because really the challenge that we identified to resolve was, number one, that research at the universities are not particularly addressing the stakeholders' needs. And in this case, stakeholders were meant the agencies. And the number two was that the scale at which we deal with are not compatible. So that, what does it take? This is a research coordination network. And so we welcome any of you who are interested in this particular topic to join. There's approximately 30 people so far. And we certainly, if anybody's interested, please reach out to me and let me know. The second was, or is, a proposal that was, again, funded by National Science Foundation 2 years ago, titled Integrated Socio-Technical Framework to Evaluate and Enhance Resiliency in Islanded Communities. And this had to do with the island of Puerto Rico, and my things are not coming through, so I'm just going to move them around. So here was basically the idea was that the island of Puerto Rico was hit by Hurricane Maria, and so we kind of looked at what was the extent of damage and what was the role of governance in how people experienced what they experienced, which was quite severe. 3,000 people died, and there is a history of sort of the way, the role of policies on, for example, tax breaks to industry caused a cascading sort of sequence of economic sort of fall, so to say, and that led to a governance structure which was not able, it was a centralized governance in structure which was not able to react to a large storm like Maria. So in such storms, a distributed governance seems to work better. And so we kind of worked at that scale. And so that's the final thing. And finally, the Governor's Island, piece. So actually Gordon and I were introduced to each other quite a few years ago because I was interested in looking, taking images from Governor's Island and try to analyze sort of the surface temperature in New York City from Governor's Island. And so we did, as a matter of fact, we went on Tuesday, we set up our cameras and we sorry, I'm just going to move things out of the way because I cannot animate here. So we went there on Tuesday, set up our cameras and streaming live, and we started looking at the surface temperatures over time. It's currently actually taking images. And then we then followed by having our students do basically modeling of the same sort of virtual modeling of the solar and 24-hour interval in order to kind of see if we can actually come up with a reliable model, because we ground truth with measurements. And the idea is that this can be used for purposes of whatever it is that you want to analyze, whether it's exposure to excessive heat. And so if one can then do that, you can think about materials, you can talk about greenery. As a matter of fact, I have a temperature sensor stuck in a battery park right now. It's from Tuesday, we stuck it in the ground and it is still there, so that we can bring back some of this information into the virtual simulation. And so my final slide is this concept, of living labs that was the topic today, in particular the Governor's Island, because Carter asked if perhaps we could discuss this this point, and perhaps one model that would work, and again back to Saskia's or back to Matthias's point about collaboration. Perhaps the single most practical way of taking advantage of the resources available at Governor's Island is through cross-school within the US and cross-country collaboration, and perhaps in connection with an academic institution that currently exists at the Governor's Island, which is the Harbor High. And because it is an existing, it relates to mobility, human mobility, it relates to empowering, and it would be on a subject of critical importance, which, I think it also fits within the curriculum. So with that, I will, Matthias, I will stop here, and I would be more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Masoot. And this question of collaboration really intrigues me, because like we've talked earlier about Samantha's question about the sort of equity, like she basically says outside the box thinking is fantastic for planners, community engagement, economic development, but can actually be detrimental to workers and managers of large hidden infrastructures that depend on well-developed engineering and labor rules. And then Max Lerner has another question, which also I think asks a similar question, is that who says sometimes these policies cannot be effectively rolled out by the different sectors, be them public, private, or government simultaneously, because they have different interests. And we all know that in order to overcome that, and that's what's so great about living labs, collaboration, and through collaboration, bringing everyone on the table and working through problems with the entire group is really critical. And so my question to you is when you are looking to collaborate, how do you you talk about people have similar interests everywhere, and that you can sort them out in some way through collaborations, but how do you make sure that the collaborative models remain as inclusive and equitable as possible?
I can just tell you my own experience, and sorry to be kind of stuck on paper publications, but I can just refer to the paper that we recently published, Nature Communications. My co-authors is a professor of economics at NYU and a professor of environmental health at the School of Medicine. And the way this started was just by talking. And so perhaps an indirect way of answering the bigger question, which is quite a complex question that I think you have, is to be able to exchange, to have the platform for exchange of ideas. and to be able to actually have conversations. And I think it is through that medium that collaboration becomes possible.
Thank you. Sonia, would you like to ask one final question before we let Carter conclude this gathering?
Sure, happy to. I mean, building on the remarks that you just made, Matthias, regarding equity and regarding collaboration, one of the key features in my mind of a living lab is the participation of those living within the communities that the lab is situated in. So I'm wondering, in addition to collaborating with people across disciplines, across sectors, government, private, I'm wondering whether you have worked with community participants to actually frame research questions. In other words, building on the long history of participatory-based action research, to what extent is this now becoming a key feature of the work that we all do? And Masoot, maybe you could speak to this, and perhaps others if you've been engaged in this type of work.
I can only point, for example, an example would be the NYCHA housing complexes. So as an urban school, we are very close to one of the largest housing complexes in New York City. And in the study of some of the exposure, particularly the heat wave effects, we're starting a project with the Department of Health. And one of the key elements of this collaboration will be students of the school next to us who live in the housing complexes, as approximately, I would say, 30 students who would continuously collect information, who would continuously tap their families with respect to their experiences of the environment. So we kind of combine quantitative and qualitative measures as we go, through the process of understanding the dynamics of exposure to extremes.
Great, very, very helpful to hear about. Look forward to reading that paper.
Saskia, do you have anything to respond to Sonia's question? And specifically within this problem of, like, you're working in a neighborhood that is transforming, that brings where new people are coming into the neighborhoods and at a scale that is very different from where you started. How do you work on that connection?
Well, we have decided around a year ago to not just always focus on sustainability, or at least not in the first place, because many people are interested in their neighborhood, are interested in each other or in whatever, but not primarily in sustainability. And what we shouldn't do, I think, is, especially with these people who live in the socially rented houses, who have completely different interests, we should try to get them in. And sustainability is not the first subject to touch on often. That's what we found. So it can also be something else, like collective cooking groups, for instance, that come into existence now, or planting new trees and bushes together in the area, which is a very small scale thing, but which is a way of engaging people in their neighborhood. And green is something, anyway, that many, many people think is very important. And another, way to work is storytelling. We are busy creating a storytelling canteen in the area where people can come up with their personal stories about whatever. It's a way of getting to know each other. But storytelling is also, a way of interviewing people in order to find out what their main concerns or problems are in the area. And it often makes people feel very comfortable when they have a narrative, and it gives a lot of information in a more friendly way, so to say. So that is also a way. And one more small example I can give: we have started handing out sensor kits in order to measure the air quality in the area and small particles in the air, small dust particles and nitrogen. And that is a way of reaching out to people that, especially men, that are not always interested in other things we do, but it's a way of getting new people in who are interested, especially in technology and in data sets and combining data. So you always have to keep looking for new small projects that are interesting for people who are not engaged yet. You have to be very creative in that sense.
I really love that, and specifically making the connection to young people in the same way that Masoot does it, in the same way that the folks at the Stone Living Lab are going to be doing that. So thank you all very much, Saskia, Masoot, for your presentations, the others for your questions. Apologies for not having a lot of time to go deeper into the questions, and I'd like to now give the floor back to Carter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthijs. And let me add a few more things. We're going to say one more hello before we say goodbye. So those of you who have joined us in the background while you're busy multitasking and doing other work, feel free to come back in front of the camera and say hello before we say goodbye. I want to thank everyone who took time out of their busy workday and their busy lives to join us today for this exchange. I want to thank Sophie and Zwanette here in the background, but doing a lot of the technical work. I see Sophie over there. I see Zwanette. A couple zip codes that way, but thank you for joining us. And I especially want to thank all the speakers, Saskia, Sonia, Masoot, Matthijs. I fully agree, incremental steps that we all take as individuals, scale them up through our organizations and our institutions, we really can create positive and dramatic change over the next 20 years. I saw it yesterday, just when I rode my bike over the Queensboro Bridge, when what had been an asphalt wasteland from 20 years ago, you now see cool roof and solar installations happening on Ravenswood houses, the largest public housing development in New York City. That was inconceivable 20 years ago. We saw a giant biologically sterile bulkhead along Ravenswood and Queensbridge Park that did nothing for the environment for 50 years, and that's been reconstructed. And we saw the fleet conversion of the New York City Department of Transportation happening right under the Queensboro Bridge, where their old fossil fuel vehicles are now being supplanted and replaced by EVs. So it is happening. We can do it if we keep working together. This was the first of a series of programs that'll happen over this fall. So if you join today, you'll get an invitation to continue these sort of building with nature conversations and exchanges, October, November, December. So let me just pause one more time to say thanks everyone, a virtual handshake to you all, and I wish you a productive and inspiring remaining days in New York City Climate Week. Have a great day. Stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey.